And so we are recording. So anything you say can and may be used against you in a court of law. Chapter 3 is how to code and test a Windows Forms application. In this class, I've said this a couple times. I'm going to repeat it. We will build both consoles, which are command line, and what are called GUIs, like GUI Buttercake, graphical user interfaces. This is all about GUIs, graphical user interfaces. Obviously, in the real world, users expect GUIs, but then in academics, it helps to do consoles in a learning environment. It helps you to learn the concepts, often cases to learn console apps as well. So a challenge that newcomers have is that they have to learn how to do all of this code in both environments. You're going to have to learn how to code for a console and a GUI. And so it's all C#, but it's just a little different. And so we just wrote a couple of console apps. What was the line of code that we used to accept user input from a console app? Console.readline. Okay, and then we took that read line and we converted that into a float using a convert to single, right? But here in chapter 3, we're not doing consoles. Instead, we're doing GUIs. So I'm just going to start by doing one of the problems that we just did, and I'm going to do it in a GUI, and we can talk about it and ask questions and so on and so forth, okay? And you're going to see how it's a little bit different. And so this is not a code along. I'm just asking that you watch right now and ask questions as they come up. So I'm going to start by creating a new project, right? Since I'm not in chapter 2 anymore, I'm in chapter 3. I'm going to start a Windows Form app. Now, typically what I like to do is filter C# right here, and I click on desktop. And you get two options. There's the Windows Form app, which is the newer one, and the .NET Framework, which is the older one. So I'm going to click on Windows Forms app. And for my Mac users, I want to make sure that you guys have this option. So could you follow along and just tell me that that's there? That you, if you filtered by the C# and desktop, that you have a Windows Form app available for you. I know I said it's not a code along, but I immediately changed that. As a reminder, this next screen is the location on your hard drive. And so I need to change this to be the repository. And because I still only have one cloned, I'm going to select the lab folder right here. Solution name chapter 03. And I'll just call this class demo. Then click create. And if I open up Solution Explorer and pin that window so you guys can kind of see what's going on, it's loading things. And now I've got a window for the graphical interface. Let me click pause real quick. Okay, so we are just going to demo a something that we just did, and we're just going to do it in a GUI instead of a command line. And where I left off was this slide right here, or this screen right here. I created the project inside of a solution. And keep in mind, on the left-hand side, you have the toolbox. So this toolbox I like to keep pinned, and these are all the common controls, right, that you can drag and drop. And so the first one was miles to kilometers, right? So let's give the user a text box, right? So I'm going to drag, I scroll down on my toolbox. I can drag and drop the text box. I can double click the text box. You know, there's a lot of ways to get a text box over on this form. But this is called rapid application development because you basically drag and drop a text box, and you can kind of change its width just by dragging the handles. You can change its alignment just by dragging it around on the form. Okay. Now, a good practice, anytime you add a new control to a form, a good practice is to name that, give that control a name. And so this text box has a name by default. If you remember, there's a properties window. Right click and go to properties. And that brings up this properties window over here on the right. And you can scroll through this. There's a lot to look at. But on the surface, I just want to point out some of these values on the right, some of these are in bold, some of them are not in bold. So when I'm looking for the name of a control, you could scroll down. Can everyone see this? The name property is in bold. Can everyone kind of see that? It's a little hard to see. You got to pay close attention. But that's how you can find the name property really quick, because it's bold and really not too much else is. Okay, so if you find the name, now up here, you can change these, because right now these are grouped by category. See this little button right here? This button would change it to group these by alphabetical. Notice these are not really alphabetical, they're in categories. If I click this button, these are all the properties in alphabetical order. They go from A up at the top to W down at the bottom. Or you could click by category, and it kind of groups them into accessibility, appearance, behavior, data, design, focus, and layout, so on and so forth. Right? I keep mine in category, and again, the design is under here. I'm going to call this text num miles. What convention is that? I just said camel. Yeah, that's right. Camel. Right? So I also want to point something out. The first three letters, this is a convention where you identify what type of control it is in the first three letters. So it is camel casing, but when I add controls, TXT for text box, BTN for button, RDO for radio button, CHK for checkbox, okay, you're going to see that my convention is to put the type of control as the first three letters of the identifier. Just like we identify variables, we identify our controls. Okay, so this text box is called text number of miles, and I'm going to drag a label onto here. And this label, you're going to find out this label, could I name it? I just said always name your label or always name your controls. I will. I'll say LBL num miles. Okay, now I want to change it from saying label 1. I want it to say something different. And so that's under appearance. Under appearance, I've got the text property that says label 1. I'll say, please enter a number of miles. Yeah? So I've changed the text property. You can see I can kind of drag this and align it however I want. Top alignment, bottom alignment, middle alignment. You get some visual lines to kind of help you with that. Okay. Let's add in a button now. Make it ridiculously big. The name will be button convert, BTN convert. If you want to say 2 km to kilometers, button convert to kilometers. And the text convert to kilometers. Is that one word? One word. Convert to kilometers. So I give my controls an identifier under its name, and I change its text, and that's what the user sees. This is just called design view. You're designing the interface. And this is drag and drop, and you're changing properties. There's really not a whole lot of coding going on at this stage.
Is it just like to make your website more like viewable, or is this like what?
This is the look, but it's not a website. We're not doing websites here. Eventually, we will put C# in a website, and that's kind of your third semester or fourth semester. But right now, we're building desktop applications. Let me show you. If I were to
like just like Twitter, like an app.
Twitter is a website, and you can install it as a mobile app. But these are desktop apps. In other words, you click on Windows, you click on Adobe After Effects. This is installed on my computer. So what we're building here are applications that you would have to install on an end user's computer.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Yep. So if I were to run this, start without debugging, here it is right here. Now I could click this button until my heart's content. It's not doing anything because all I've done is design the interface. I could put in numbers here. Doesn't matter. Now, what we want to do is we want to say, hey, when the user clicks this button to run some code, we're going to write some code. Now, right here, I've showed you these two buttons, categorized and alphabetical, right? I've showed you these two buttons. These next two buttons switch back and forth between what are called properties and events. When I click this button, these are all the properties of my button. When I click the lightning bolt, you guys will all need to know this at some point, so let's zone in now. When you click the lightning bolt, these are all the events that this button can use to respond to code. Not to respond to code. To respond to the user interacting with your application. And so every control has a default event. And if you were to double click this button, it would generate a click event for us. So again, one thing that you could do is just double click a button. It will generate a click event for us. I'm going to show you if I go into this events window and I double click right here in this empty space. This is another way of generating a click event. Watch what's happened if I double click right here. Notice it takes me into a file called form1.cs. This is my C# code. And notice it made this button convert to kilometers _click. This line right here is known as an event handler. This is a click event handler for my button. In other words, when the user clicks the button, it's going to run my code right here. There was actually a lot of code that was generated for me. And if I dive into some files in here, let me do some digging here. If I hold down this, boy, they do a good job of hiding this anymore. Let me see if I can find it. It actually it wrote a lot of code for me just to get that button on the screen. It generated a button, what's called a button object. But let me see if I can't find it anymore. They hide it so well.
Right click and view code maybe.
Well, no, that's going to bring me here. And let's see here. That's not it. There. Okay. I forgot. Under Form 1, I just want to point this out. I'm going to close everything. Close. I'm going to close the designer. This is not necessarily, if you dig around like I just did, you'll come across this and you might wonder what this is. I just want to explain this. under form 1, this is my form that I just created. So if you ever close this, just go back over into Solution Explorer and reopen it up right here. This is my form designer. And if I right click view code, it takes me to what's called the code behind the form. This is the code behind file. Okay, so this is the designer and this is the code behind. Okay, but there was actually a lot of code that was generated for me just to get this drag and drop to work. And if I open up the designer CS, here's a little bit of code. Look at my identifiers on line 79. Text number of miles, label num miles, button. Look at the data types. My data types are a type of text box, a type of label, a type of button. And if I expand this, notice it's working with the location property, the name property, the size property. All of this code was generated by drag and drop. So behind the drag and drop, I just want everyone to realize there's a lot of code generation happening, which is why Microsoft calls this rapid application development. We didn't have to code all of this C#. All of this C# was basically handled for us. You really won't touch this file. This file that I just opened up, which is, again, this is under Form 1 right here, form1.designer.cs. You really won't, with very few exceptions, you won't touch this file, especially as beginners. As you become more intermediate and advanced, maybe you can start dabbling in here. Okay, but beginners, I just want to show you code generations happening for you. You had a question?
Do you hand code like when you're in the business, or can you use that?
Yeah, so when you start getting more experience, you probably will modify that, a little bit more frequently. But beginners, we really won't do this in this class a whole lot. Okay, now let me bring it back to basics. Okay, we've got the designer, which is this file right here. Remember in our console, I didn't like the default name of Program 1. We renamed it something more descriptive. I would actually do the same here. I would rename this file to something like miles converter, something. And it says, do you want to rename everything that references Form 1? You're going to want to click yes. If you rename anything, that's called refactoring your code. You're changing the names of a variable. That's refactoring your code. All right, so now this is my miles converter design, and this is miles converter code behind, or miles converter.cs. So this is where we're actually going to write the C# that we are responsible for. Obviously, there was a lot of C# that was coded for us. Now, one thing I want to do is I need an output label. I need a label to put the answer in, right? So I'm going to drag and drop a label. I'm going to go to its properties. I'm going to name this label LBL result. So the name of my label is my result label. And I don't want it to say anything. I'm going to delete the text. I'm going to delete the text. And now that I have a results label to kind of put the answer into, I'm ready to go to work. Now I can start coding my C#. So just like my console, I need input, I need some math, and I need some output. Okay, I need to accept input from the user into a variable. So before we created a float called number of miles equals. Now in my console, I did a console.readline. But in my GUI, I've got a text box. I actually need to read from my text box. Remember I called it txt number miles? Let's talk about this line of code. Everyone look at this line of code for me. Why do you think I have a red squiggly? Well, first off, the name of my text box is called text number of miles. But whatever the user types is going to be stored in what's called the text property. Okay, so what I'm reading is I'm reading the text property of my text box. So if I were to just say text number of miles, no, I got to get the text property out of my text box. Yes.
Is it also going to be a string?
That's exactly right. So step number 1 is looking at line 16 and realizing, okay, I'm creating a variable. My data type is float. My identifier is num miles. That's what's changing. It's on the left-hand side of the assignment operator. And what it's changing to is whatever the user typed in the text box. Right? So we're going to store the number that they type in the text box in this variable called num miles. However, just like in a console, a user can type whatever they want in a text box. And when they can type whatever they want, that text property is going to give us a string. But as we learned, the data types on the left and the right have to match. Right? On the left, we've got a float. On the right, we've got a string. So how did we learn to convert to a float? What was the line of code to convert? Convert dot. Remember the next piece? To single. And then you wrap the whole text property. Let me kind of put this all so that you can see it. You see how it's similar but different? What's different? Well, what's different is instead of doing console.readLine, we're doing text number of miles.text. Right? In a command line, we have to do a read line statement that returns a string. Over here, we just use the text property of the text box that we added to the form. Good? So it's almost identical, just a little difference. Really, we could copy and paste our math. Float num kilometers equals num miles times 1.6 f. We basically did that. I think we had a constant instead. Remember the constant that we created? If I were to create that constant, const float km per mile equals 1.6 f. And then I come down here and I say km per mile. Remember that? You could argue that this code is a little bit more readable, and I would understand that argument, which you might call self-documenting code. Okay, so the math is the same. And then we have the output. Well, how did we do the output in a console? How did we do an output in the console window?
Console write line.
We did a console write line. We put $1 there. Remember that? And that did that string interpolation thing where we can mix in a string with our variables. We can do that here. Our label that we want to put the results in is label results.text. And I could do this. I could just do number of kilometers to string. So what is this? This is a string on the left and a string on the right. But that's my example of just putting the number in there without any user friendliness. We want to give the user like a user friendly output. So in order to use that $, I'm going to say string.format. And that allows us to use the syntax that we had before. And that's this $. So again, instead of just being able to say council dot writeline, we say, okay, in the text property of our label, put a string, and that string is going to say this. This many num miles, that's our variable, it'll say that many miles is that many kilometers. And then there's a semicolon at the end. Okay. And again, we have to do this string.format to do this kind of newer syntax where we can use this $, and mix our variables in with some text.
Wait, what? Let's do this.
In other words, if I leave string.format off and I just do this $, let me see, does that work?
I'm pretty sure it does.
It does work. Okay. Okay, good. I just saved you guys a lot of headache. I forgot that. So this is, we don't have to do a string.format. We could just straight do the $. The string format was the old syntax, not this newer one. Okay? So now, if I say 3 miles, notice 3 miles is 4.8 kilometers. What questions, because I just went through a lot. Christian, I saw a hand.
I don't know if this matters right now, but
Yep.
when we start using this in websites,
Uh-huh.
does this kind of just make HTML and CSS pointless?
No. What you're going to find out is you actually, if you remember JSX in React, JSX is where we kind of took JavaScript and HTML and you like mixed it together.
Yeah.
And that's what we'll wind up doing here.
Oh.
Yeah, we're going to wind up figuring out how to mix the two together. And so C# will be responsible for some things, and HTML will be responsible for others.
I guess HTML is like for how it looks, and then CSS is for like its actual function.
Yeah,
I
those
mean,
purposes
I
of
meant C.
HTML. Yeah, the purpose of HTML is like, hey, this is a heading, right? And then the CSS will say this is a red heading, and then what the actual heading says will come from the C#.
Even though we can make a heading in HTML.
Yeah, so it's a dynamic with C# versus what you would call static. Static heading would always be the same thing. Okay. What other questions? What other questions about this?
Is there like a vocab thing to know what the different?
What each line does?
Yeah,
I mean,
like the different things that you like put in to like do the different things like.
yeah. So
Vocab, was it something like somewhere like to better understand it?
yeah. So it starts with that lecture last Friday where it's like, okay, what is a float? What is a data type? You know? And so to understand each piece of this, you got to start with what we learned last Friday, understanding what is a float, what is a const, what is an identifier, you know? And so we've kind of covered those bases. I'm happy to cover them again, though, you know? Yep, definitely a good idea to take notes. All right. I'm gonna just stop this lecture here. We will continue this lecture tomorrow.